Snow drifted across the marble steps of the Royal Academy like scattered pages from a forgotten story, while the bells of St. Edmund's Cathedral echoed through the freezing London morning. Beneath the towering stone archway, where generations of respected teachers had begun honorable careers, one young woman watched her future being destroyed before the eyes of the kingdom. Every snowflake seemed to linger in the air, as though even winter itself hesitated to witness such cruelty. Catherine Ashford stood perfectly still despite the biting wind. At 26, she possessed the quiet grace of someone who had spent years shaping young minds instead of chasing society's approval. Her modest brown wool dress had been carefully mended at the sleeves, and a weathered leather satchel rested against her side, filled with lesson plans, children's stories, and handmade learning cards she had crafted by candlelight. She refused to lower her eyes, even as hundreds of nobles stared as though she carried a contagious disgrace. Lady Victoria Blackwell stepped forward with theatrical elegance, wrapped in luxurious sable fur that contrasted sharply against the white snow. Between gloved fingers she held Catherine's teaching certificate, the parchment that represented years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and unwavering devotion to education. Her cold smile widened before she slowly tore the document into long, uneven strips. The sound of ripping paper seemed unnaturally loud, silencing even the whispers for a heartbeat. Then the fragments floated downward, disappearing into the snow at Catherine's feet. "She struck a noble child," Lady Victoria declared for everyone to hear. The accusation spread through the crowd like smoke carried by the wind. "She's dangerous. No respectable family would trust her. Children should fear teachers like her." No voice rose in Catherine's defense. No witness stepped forward. No one mentioned the frozen pond outside the academy where another frightened child had nearly drowned 2 weeks earlier. No one admitted that Catherine had shoved Lady Victoria's arrogant son aside only because he had recklessly clung to another boy, dragging them both beneath cracking ice. Catherine had managed to save the servant's son, while the wealthy family transformed their embarrassment into a convenient lie. The grateful servant had been threatened with dismissal if he ever spoke the truth. The academy protected privilege instead of justice. Catherine understood that long before this morning. She bent quietly and gathered the torn pieces of her certificate without trembling. Every fragment disappeared into her satchel beside the carefully prepared lessons she would likely never teach. Tears threatened, but she refused to offer her enemies the satisfaction. Dignity was the only possession they could not confiscate. A polished black carriage rolled slowly along the edge of the square before coming to an unexpected stop. Behind its frosted window sat Duke John Seymour. At 37, John carried himself with the restrained confidence expected of one of England's most respected noblemen. Clean-shaven and broad-shouldered, he wore a dark winter traveling coat fastened neatly over an embroidered waistcoat. His sharp hazel eyes rarely betrayed emotion anymore. 3 years earlier they had once reflected warmth and laughter, but grief had quietly hollowed them after his beloved wife's sudden illness claimed her life. Since then, duty had replaced joy, and silence had become his closest companion. His coachman waited for instructions. John never gave them. Instead, he watched the young teacher kneel alone in the snow collecting what remained of her ruined career. Something about her composure unsettled him. Most people pleaded. Some argued. Others collapsed beneath humiliation. She simply gathered the broken pieces and stood again. The carriage continued toward Seymour Estate, but Catherine's face refused to leave his thoughts. That afternoon, John stopped unexpectedly at the academy grounds instead of returning directly home. An elderly groundskeeper clearing snow recognized the Duke immediately and respectfully removed his cap. During their conversation, John casually mentioned the dismissed teacher. The old man's expression changed from caution to sorrow before he quietly revealed everything the newspapers refused to print. Catherine had never attacked anyone. She had sacrificed her own reputation to save a servant's child because no innocent life mattered less than noble pride. John thanked him without another word. As his carriage climbed the winding road home, his thoughts drifted toward Seymour Hall. Its magnificent halls echoed with absence. 5 children wandered through rooms built for happiness yet filled only with memories. Emily, 11, had become more mother than sister, carrying silent responsibilities no child deserved. William, 10, trusted no adult who promised to stay. Charlotte, 8, escaped into secret sketches hidden beneath loose floorboards. Oliver, 6, buried loneliness beneath endless mischief. Little Rose, only 4 when tragedy struck, had not spoken a single word since watching her mother's funeral procession disappear beyond the estate gates. 7 governesses had come. 7 had failed. Some resigned after days. Others lasted only hours. Books remained unopened. Music rooms gathered dust. Laughter had vanished from Seymour Hall. Every famous governess in England had politely declined his latest invitations. Hope itself had become difficult to employ. As evening settled across London, Catherine left the academy carrying her satchel and little else. Snow continued falling as merchants packed their stalls and elegant ladies hurried toward warm drawing rooms. She stopped beside a stone fountain, wondering where she would sleep once her savings disappeared. Before uncertainty could overwhelm her, footsteps approached across the frozen pavement. John Seymour stood before her without servants, titles, or ceremony. She recognized him immediately. The Duke? He met her gaze steadily. "I've been told what truly happened." Catherine said nothing. "I don't need another explanation." Silence stretched between them while nearby shoppers slowed to watch. Finally, John spoke the words that stunned the square into absolute stillness. "Would you teach my children?" For one breath nobody moved. Then laughter erupted from every direction. A merchant shook his head. Two noblewomen exchanged amused glances. Someone muttered that grief had finally driven the Duke mad. Catherine stared at him, convinced she had misunderstood. "You know what they're saying about me." "I know," John replied quietly. "I also know you protected a child when everyone else protected their reputation. A teacher willing to lose everything for one frightened boy is exactly the teacher my children deserve." The laughter faded into astonished whispers as Catherine struggled to answer. Before she could find the words, a small carriage carrying Seymour luggage arrived beside them. Hidden behind its frosted window, unseen by either adult, a tiny little girl with solemn blue eyes reached one hand toward Catherine as if recognizing someone she had been waiting for all along. The first morning at Seymour Hall arrived beneath a sky the color of silver glass. Snow rested across the ancient gardens, softened the stone statues, and quieted every sound except the distant caw of ravens perched upon the bare oaks. The magnificent estate looked like a palace carved from winter itself, beautiful enough to inspire wonder, yet so silent that it felt abandoned by happiness long ago. Catherine awoke before sunrise and wandered through the vast corridors carrying only a candle and her worn satchel. Portraits of generations past lined the walls, their painted smiles faded beneath years of dust and grief. Every polished floor reflected empty rooms waiting to be filled with voices again. Even the servants moved with careful footsteps, as though laughter had become forbidden within those walls. Breakfast began in uneasy silence. Emily sat with perfect posture, carefully buttering bread for Rose before touching her own plate. Though only 11, responsibility had settled across her shoulders with quiet dignity. William watched Catherine constantly, suspicion clouding every glance. Charlotte barely looked up from the tiny notebook hidden beneath the tablecloth where she secretly sketched everything she loved but feared losing. Oliver attempted to balance a spoon on his nose until Emily gently lowered it. Little Rose simply stared into her bowl, her tiny fingers wrapped around the faded ribbon that had once belonged to her mother. John observed everything from the head of the table. He noticed Catherine never forced conversation. She simply smiled. When breakfast ended, she surprised everyone by closing every grammar book stacked inside the schoolroom cabinet. William folded his arms. "Aren't you supposed to make a study?" "I am," Catherine answered softly. "But first I'd like to discover how each of you learns." Confusion replaced resistance. Instead of opening textbooks, she led them toward the kitchens, where warm ovens filled the air with the comforting scent of rising bread. The elderly cook blinked in astonishment as Catherine tied an apron around herself and handed smaller ones to the children. Flour soon dusted little noses and sleeves. Oliver accidentally covered William with a cloud of white powder, then froze, expecting punishment. Instead, Catherine laughed so sincerely that even Emily struggled to hide a smile. "Every loaf begins as a mess," Catherine said while kneading dough. "People often do too." The children quietly remembered those words. Later they carried baskets of fresh bread to the stable. The horses greeted them with impatient nickers. Instead of lectures about responsibility, Catherine showed them how gentle hands earn trust more quickly than loud commands. Charlotte brushed an aging mare whose silver coat glimmered beneath winter sunlight. William carefully filled feeding buckets without being asked. Oliver proudly introduced himself to every horse as though greeting old friends. Rose rested one tiny hand against a patient pony's nose, watching it breathe warm clouds into the icy air. John observed from an upstairs window. He had expected disorder. Instead he found peace. The following afternoon Catherine transformed the library into a place of discovery instead of discipline. She gathered blankets before the crackling fireplace and read adventure stories aloud, changing her voice for every character until Oliver laughed so hard he nearly rolled across the rug. Emily gradually leaned closer without realizing it. William pretended not to listen, though he quietly corrected Oliver whenever details were forgotten. When the story ended, Catherine handed each child a sheet of handmade paper. "Write one secret wish," she whispered. "No names." They carried the folded papers outside beneath falling snow and tucked them into the hollow trunk of an ancient oak overlooking the frozen gardens. "The tree keeps promises," Catherine explained. "Does it answer them?" Oliver asked. "Only if we help it." That evening Charlotte timidly revealed the hidden sketchbook she had guarded for months. Catherine turned every page slowly, admiring charcoal drawings of birds, gardens, fireplaces, and smiling faces that no longer existed inside the estate. Rather than correcting mistakes, she praised the courage required to place hope onto paper. Together they painted snow-covered trees outside the window using watered colors mixed inside tiny porcelain dishes. For the first time since his wife's death, John paused outside the art room simply to watch children creating instead of mourning. Only Rose remained unreachable. She never spoke. She never smiled. She carried silence as faithfully as another child carried a favorite doll. Catherine refused to force words that grief had buried. Instead, each evening after everyone slept, she carved a tiny wooden bird inside the servants' workshop. One became blue like the winter sky. Another wore painted crimson wings. One carried tiny golden speckles across its back. She quietly placed each bird outside Rose's bedroom before dawn without leaving any explanation. Every morning the bird disappeared. Every evening another appeared. Days slipped gently into weeks. The servants began noticing remarkable changes. Emily laughed while washing dishes beside the cook. William voluntarily repaired broken fences with stable hands. Charlotte filled entire shelves with cheerful paintings. Oliver no longer played cruel tricks merely to gain attention. Even John found himself lingering over breakfast instead of escaping immediately to estate business. Hope returned so gradually that nobody recognized its arrival until one bright winter morning. Catherine placed another painted bird outside Rose's door. When she turned to leave, a tiny voice drifted through the hallway behind her. Again. The single word barely rose above a whisper. Yet it struck the silent corridor like cathedral bells. Catherine slowly looked back. Rose held the little bird tightly against her chest. Her blue eyes waited with quiet expectation. Across the landing, John had stepped from his study carrying correspondence. The letters slipped unnoticed from his hands onto the polished floor. Tears filled his eyes before he realized they were falling. His youngest daughter had spoken for the first time in nearly 3 years, and the impossible miracle belonged entirely to the woman everyone else had condemned. Someone else witnessed the moment. Standing unseen beneath the grand staircase, Lady Eleanor Seymour lowered her traveling cloak after arriving unexpectedly from London. She watched Rose clutch Catherine's hand, watched John staring with hope he had not carried since becoming a widower, and felt resentment bloom beneath her elegant smile. Before sunset she quietly ordered a servant to light the fireplace inside Catherine's classroom, then dropped every carefully written lesson journal into the flames, whispering, "Teachers always leave." Winter tightened its grip on Seymour Hall until every morning arrived wrapped in white silence. Frost traced delicate patterns across tall windows, and the frozen river bordering the estate shimmered beneath pale sunlight like polished glass. The beauty deceived everyone except Catherine. She had grown up beside country streams and understood that the loveliest ice often concealed the deepest danger. The warmth that had begun returning to the estate faded after Lady Eleanor's arrival. She wore kindness before the Duke and poison behind his back. Whenever John left to inspect tenant farms or attend county meetings, Eleanor gathered the children beneath the grand staircase and filled the quiet hours with carefully chosen words. "Teachers never stay," she would murmur while pretending to mend Emily's glove. "They promise forever. Then one morning they're simply gone." The words lodged inside hearts already bruised by loss. William withdrew first. He stopped volunteering answers during Catherine's lessons. He returned books without discussion. When she asked whether he wished to help feed the horses, he simply shrugged and walked away. Emily noticed everything but struggled to protect everyone at once. Charlotte quietly sketched fewer smiling faces. Oliver laughed less often. Even little Rose clung to her painted wooden birds with anxious fingers, afraid another goodbye might already be approaching. Catherine understood the distance growing between them, yet she refused to compete against fear with arguments. Instead she remained patient. One snowy afternoon she discovered William standing alone in the stable brushing the old gray mare. Without mentioning his silence, she picked up another brush and worked beside him. Minutes passed. Only the horses breathed. Finally William whispered, "Everyone leaves eventually." Catherine continued brushing the mare's thick winter coat. "Some people leave because they choose to." She gently untangled a knot in the horse's mane. "Others are pushed away." William looked toward her. "Which one are you?" Catherine smiled sadly. "I hope neither." He said nothing more, but his guarded expression softened ever so slightly before he returned to his work. From an upstairs balcony, John witnessed the quiet exchange. He realized Catherine never demanded trust. She earned it one gentle moment at a time. That evening he found the ashes of her lesson journals still carefully folded inside her desk. "I should replace them," he said. She shook her head. "They're gone." "I'm sorry." "They were only paper." John looked at the blackened pages. "They were years of your life." She met his eyes with calm honesty. If children keep learning, nothing important has truly been lost. For the first time in years, John found himself admiring someone not because of beauty or title, but because grief had failed to harden her kindness. The following Saturday dawned unusually bright after days of heavy snowfall. The frozen river sparkled beneath clear blue skies. Servants warned everyone to stay away from the ice until warmer weather returned. The children promised they understood. They did not. William believed the river looked perfectly safe. Oliver begged to see it. Charlotte wanted to sketch the snow-covered banks. Emily reluctantly followed to keep everyone together. Rose quietly trailed behind, clutching one of Catherine's painted birds inside her pocket. While Catherine prepared warm cider inside the kitchen, the 5 children slipped through the garden gate unnoticed. Lady Eleanor watched them leave from an upstairs window. She made no attempt to stop them. The frozen river welcomed them with deceptive beauty. Snow covered the surface like soft velvet. William tested the ice with cautious steps. It held. Soon Oliver laughed as he slid across the smooth surface. Charlotte sketched from the shore. Emily repeatedly urged everyone to stay close. Then William noticed untouched ice farther downstream. "I'll only look," he called. He took 3 more steps. A sharp crack echoed across the valley. Emily's face drained of color. "William." The ice shattered beneath him. Freezing black water swallowed him instantly. He surfaced once, gasping in terror as jagged sheets of ice broke around his shoulders. Oliver screamed. Charlotte dropped her sketchbook. Emily ran toward the servants racing across the distant field. Nobody moved onto the ice. Every man knew another step could send them into the river as well. Panic rooted them where they stood. At that exact moment Catherine rounded the path carrying a basket of warm bread. The children's cries reached her before the river came into view. She saw William struggling beneath collapsing ice. Without hesitation she threw aside the basket. "Stay back," she shouted. Instead of running upright, she dropped flat onto the frozen surface. Her weight spread across the ice. Slowly she crawled forward. Every movement produced another terrifying crack beneath her hands. John appeared moments later on horseback after hearing desperate shouting from the estate. He dismounted before the horse stopped moving. "Catherine." She ignored him. William's strength was fading. His fingers slipped beneath the icy water. Catherine quickly unwound her long wool scarf. "William." He barely lifted his head. "Take it." She stretched farther than the fragile ice should have allowed. The scarf brushed his fingertips. "Miss." She reached farther. Another crack exploded beneath her chest. The river groaned. William lunged desperately and seized the end of the scarf. "I've got you," Catherine whispered, planting both knees against the weakening ice. Behind her, John carefully crawled forward. "Don't pull yet," Catherine warned. "If he panics, the ice will break again." Together they counted softly. 1. William steadied his breathing. 2. John gripped Catherine's waist to anchor her. 3. They pulled together. William slid across the broken edge onto solid ice. Emily rushed forward sobbing and wrapped her brother tightly in her arms. For one glorious heartbeat everyone believed the danger had ended. Then the ice beneath Catherine gave way completely. She vanished into the river. The freezing current swallowed her without mercy. John dove after her before anyone could stop him. The water stole his breath instantly. Through the dark current he spotted Catherine sinking beneath floating sheets of ice, her dress dragging her downward. He seized her arm. Fought toward the surface. Servants threw ropes from the bank. Together they dragged both of them from the river onto the snow. Catherine lay unconscious. Her lips had turned pale blue. John lifted her into his arms without waiting for assistance. Snow lashed against his face as the blizzard returned with astonishing speed. He carried her the entire distance back to Seymour Hall while the children followed behind in terrified silence. Doctors arrived within the hour. They wrapped Catherine in heated blankets and placed warm stones beside the bed. Still she did not awaken. Night settled heavily across the estate. One by one the servants drifted away. The children reluctantly slept together in Emily's room, frightened that morning might bring another farewell. Only John remained beside Catherine. He replaced cool cloths, fed the fire, adjusted blankets. Every few minutes he reached for her wrist, reassuring himself that her heartbeat still answered beneath trembling skin. Near dawn her eyelids fluttered open. She tried to lift her hands but could not stop their violent shaking. Without speaking, John gently gathered both freezing hands inside his own. He rubbed warmth back into her fingers with careful patience. Catherine looked at him in quiet surprise. His hands trembled even harder than hers. Not from the cold. From the fear of almost losing her. Neither confessed what had changed between them. Neither needed words. Outside the half-open bedroom door, hidden within the shadows of the corridor, Lady Eleanor watched their joined hands with growing hatred, already deciding that saving William had made Catherine far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The days following Catherine's rescue settled over Seymour Hall with a strange mixture of gratitude and quiet unease. Winter still ruled the countryside, yet something warmer had begun stirring within the ancient estate. William no longer hid when Catherine entered a room. Emily watched her with open admiration instead of cautious hope. Charlotte filled fresh sketchbooks with scenes of birds, fireplaces, and smiling faces. Oliver proudly announced to every servant that their teacher was braver than any knight in England. Little Rose never walked anywhere without one of Catherine's painted wooden birds tucked safely into her pocket. Even the servants carried themselves differently, as though the long season of mourning had finally begun to loosen its grip. Only one heart grew colder. Lady Eleanor Seymour observed every change with silent fury. She saw John lingering after breakfast simply to ask Catherine how she had slept. She noticed him carrying heavy baskets before Catherine could lift them herself. She caught the children laughing together in hallways once filled only with echoes. Each small kindness felt like another victory stolen from her. She convinced herself that Catherine had bewitched the household with false humility. If she could not drive the teacher away through doubt, she would destroy her through disgrace. One icy afternoon, while Catherine accompanied the children to deliver blankets and bread to elderly villagers living on the estate's outskirts, Eleanor quietly entered the Seymour family vault with a duplicate key she had secretly kept for years. Resting inside a velvet-lined chest lay Lady Margaret Seymour's sapphire necklace, a priceless heirloom passed from one generation to the next. Eleanor wrapped the necklace inside a linen cloth before slipping unnoticed into Catherine's bedroom. She hid the jewels beneath folded dresses inside the bottom drawer of the teacher's wardrobe, then calmly returned the empty chest to the vault before anyone noticed it had been opened. That evening panic swept through Seymour Hall. The necklace had vanished. Servants searched drawing rooms. Maids emptied cabinets. Footmen questioned gardeners. John personally supervised the search, refusing to accuse anyone until every possibility had been exhausted. Eleanor stood beside him wearing a mask of concerned dignity. "Everyone must allow their rooms to be inspected," she suggested gently. "No exceptions." Catherine quietly nodded. "If it helps find your family's treasure, you may search mine first." The guards entered her modest room. The children crowded anxiously into the corridor. Emily clasped Rose's hand. William stared toward the open doorway with growing unease. Minutes later one of the guards emerged carrying the sapphire necklace. Silence crashed over the hallway. The jewels sparkled beneath the chandelier. Every servant lowered their eyes. Oliver looked from the necklace to Catherine in complete confusion. Charlotte's sketchbook slipped from her trembling fingers. John's face drained of color. He stepped into Catherine's room himself. The necklace lay exactly where the guard claimed to have discovered it. Everything appeared undeniable. Eleanor sighed sadly. "I prayed this wasn't true." Catherine looked at the necklace only once. Then she looked at John. There was no anger in her expression. Only disappointment that fate had chosen to repeat itself. "I didn't take it." Her voice remained calm. John wanted to believe her. Every instinct born from the past weeks screamed that she could never betray his family. Yet the evidence stood before him. "I know what I believe about you," he said quietly. "But I must also protect this household." Catherine understood the impossible position in which he stood. She did not beg. She did not argue. She simply bowed her head. I won't allow your children to witness another public humiliation." That night she packed the few belongings she still possessed. Her clothing fit neatly inside the same weathered satchel she had carried from the academy. She carefully wrapped Rose's painted birds inside a wool scarf. From the desk drawer she collected the surviving charred pages rescued from her burned lesson journals. Nothing else truly belonged to her. Before dawn she quietly walked through the sleeping house. She paused outside every child's bedroom. A tiny painted bird rested beside each door. No farewell letter waited beneath them. Only silent gratitude. She reached the front entrance just as snow began falling again. The heavy doors closed behind her without a sound. Morning shattered the fragile peace. Oliver ran eagerly toward the schoolroom carrying a wooden toy horse. It stood empty. Charlotte found the painted bird outside her bedroom. Emily discovered Catherine's room stripped of every personal possession. William searched the gardens before panic overtook him. Rose wandered silently through every corridor clutching her newest wooden bird against her chest. John read the brief note Catherine had left upon the library desk. It contained only one sentence. "Please tell the children none of this was their fault." The words struck him harder than any accusation ever could. By noon the estate felt colder than it had on the day Catherine first arrived. Rose quietly slipped away while everyone searched the grounds. No servant noticed. No guard questioned the tiny figure wrapped in a blue winter cloak. She simply followed the faint footprints Catherine had left across the fresh snow beyond the estate gates. Hours passed before Emily realized her youngest sister was missing. Fear exploded through Seymour Hall. Servants scattered across fields and forests calling Rose's name. John mounted his horse before anyone finished saddling it. The storm had grown violent. Snow erased tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. Then John noticed something nearly invisible beneath drifting snow. Tiny footprints. Beside them marched the deeper prints of Catherine's worn boots. He urged the horse forward. Miles away Catherine had heard a frightened cry carried by the wind. She found Rose shivering beneath a fallen pine, exhausted after wandering through the blizzard. Without hesitation Catherine lifted the child into her arms. The nearest shelter proved to be an abandoned shepherd's hut barely standing against the storm. Inside the fireplace contained no wood. The freezing air seeped through broken walls. Rose's lips had already begun turning pale. Catherine emptied her satchel. There was nothing useful except her old wooden suitcase. She stared at it only a moment before breaking it apart against the stone floor. One piece after another fed the struggling fire until warmth slowly returned. She wrapped Rose inside her own coat, keeping only a thin shawl around herself while whispering gentle stories through the endless winter night. At dawn John's search party finally reached the lonely hut. He pushed open the weathered door and stopped breathing. Rose slept peacefully against Catherine's chest beside the fading fire. The broken remains of Catherine's suitcase smoldered in the hearth. Frost covered Catherine's hair and sleeves. She had spent the entire night protecting his daughter while surrendering every comfort she possessed. As John knelt beside them, a frightened housemaid burst into the hut, sobbing uncontrollably before falling to her knees. Between broken breaths she confessed that Lady Eleanor had ordered her to place the Seymour necklace inside Catherine's room, proving at last that the woman who had twice risked her life for his children had once again been betrayed by those who feared the goodness they could never imitate. Spring arrived quietly at Seymour Hall, melting the last patches of snow that had lingered beneath the ancient oaks and filling the gardens with the fragrance of damp earth and new beginnings. Sunlight streamed through windows once dimmed by grief, and the estate no longer echoed with silence. Servants greeted one another with genuine smiles, fireplaces burned for comfort rather than loneliness, and laughter wandered freely through corridors that had forgotten its sound for far too long. Lady Eleanor departed the estate forever under John's direct order. Stripped of every privilege connected to Seymour Hall, she left without farewell, carrying only the bitterness that had ruled her choices. The frightened maid who confessed the truth received mercy instead of punishment because Catherine insisted that fear had made her obedient, not cruelty. Justice restored peace, but it could not erase the wounds left behind. Catherine recovered slowly from the freezing night inside the shepherd's hut. Though her strength returned day by day, she often woke before dawn remembering the icy wind and Rose's tiny hands clinging to her coat. Each morning John quietly asked how she felt, never pressing beyond whatever answer she wished to give. Their conversations remained simple, yet every shared glance carried a tenderness neither dared to name. The children refused to let Catherine disappear again. Emily accompanied her through the gardens whenever she walked. William insisted on chopping firewood before she reached the woodshed. Charlotte painted brighter pictures and proudly displayed them instead of hiding them beneath loose floorboards. Oliver followed Catherine everywhere with endless questions, determined to make her laugh at least once each day. Rose rarely released Catherine's hand unless sleep finally claimed her. One afternoon John found Catherine beneath the ancient wishing oak where the children had hidden their secret hopes months earlier. Together they opened the hollow trunk and unfolded the weathered papers. Emily had wished for her family to smile again. William had wished to stop being angry. Charlotte had wished for courage to share her drawings. Oliver had wished for everyone to eat dinner together every night. Rose's paper contained only a tiny painted bird because words had once been beyond her reach. John quietly unfolded the final page. It belonged to Catherine. Its single sentence read, "May these children always believe they are deeply loved." He looked at her with quiet wonder. "You never wished for yourself." She smiled gently. "They were already becoming my wish." Something within John's guarded heart finally surrendered. Yet he waited. Love born from gratitude alone could never endure. He wanted Catherine to know she was chosen freely. Unknown to both adults, the children had begun planning a surprise. With the enthusiastic help of gardeners, cooks, stable hands, and maids, they secretly restored the abandoned greenhouse their late mother had once adored. Broken glass panes were replaced. Cracked stone paths were repaired. Ivy was carefully trimmed away. Every afternoon after lessons, they planted flowers while Catherine believed they were simply helping around the estate. Emily chose white lilies to represent courage through sorrow. William planted blue irises for forgiveness. Charlotte filled long beds with hopeful yellow daffodils. Oliver scattered cheerful wildflowers in every empty corner because he insisted happiness should never grow in straight lines. Rose carefully planted tiny snowdrops beside the entrance, remembering the first painted bird waiting outside her bedroom. Birdhouses painted in bright colors hung among climbing roses, honoring Catherine's nightly gifts. When everything was finished, the greenhouse no longer resembled a forgotten ruin. It had become a living memory transformed into hope. On a warm spring afternoon John invited Catherine for a walk without revealing the destination. As they approached the restored greenhouse, sunlight poured through sparkling glass, turning thousands of blossoms into waves of color. Catherine stopped in astonishment as the great doors slowly opened. The 5 children stood waiting inside. Emily stepped forward first. Her voice trembled, but her eyes never looked away. "You taught me courage when I thought being strong meant hiding my tears." William came next. "I believe trusting people always ended in pain." "You taught me forgiveness before you ever asked for it yourself." Charlotte held out her favorite sketchbook. Every page contained drawings of moments Catherine had never realized anyone noticed. "You taught me hope," she whispered. "Now I want the whole world to see it." Oliver proudly presented a loaf of slightly crooked bread. "You taught me laughter," he said with a grin, "even when it comes out a little messy." Finally little Rose walked forward carrying a single wildflower. She looked up at Catherine with complete certainty. Then, in a clear voice that filled the greenhouse with quiet wonder, she said, "Mother." Time itself seemed to pause. Catherine fell to her knees, tears shining freely across her cheeks as Rose wrapped tiny arms around her neck. Emily, William, Charlotte, and Oliver quickly joined the embrace until all 5 children surrounded the woman who had entered their lives as a stranger and become the safest place they knew. John watched the family before him with overwhelming gratitude. He walked forward, not standing above his children but kneeling beside them. Reaching into his coat pocket, he removed a small velvet box worn smooth by generations of careful hands. Inside rested his mother's sapphire engagement ring, its deep blue stone catching the spring sunlight. "I asked you to teach my children," he said softly. His gaze moved across every smiling face. "Instead, you taught all of us how to live again." He opened the box completely. "Catherine Ashford, if your heart is willing, would you become my wife and the mother this family has already chosen?" She looked first at John, then at each child waiting breathlessly beside him. Her answer came with quiet certainty. "Yes." Joy swept through the greenhouse like birds taking flight. The servants applauded from the doorway, some openly wiping away tears. Bells from the nearby village church drifted across the gardens as though joining the celebration. Their wedding took place several months later beneath the flowering vines inside the very greenhouse the children had restored. Instead of one grand procession, each child escorted Catherine through a different section of the flower-lined aisle. Emily offered steady confidence, William protective pride, Charlotte gentle hope, Oliver delighted laughter, and Rose innocent love. By the time Catherine reached John, Every child had already given her away because every child had first welcomed her home. After the ceremony, the family walked together toward the meadow overlooking the estate. Waiting there stood a young oak tree ready to be planted. John lifted the sapling into the prepared earth while Catherine and the children knelt around it. 6 little hands and 2 adult hands covered its roots with rich spring soil. Finally, John placed a simple wooden sign beside the tree. It read, "Families are not always born. Sometimes they are chosen." The evening sun bathed the growing oak in golden light as 8 shadows stretched across the meadow, no longer separated by grief, fear, or blood alone, but joined forever by the quiet courage of one unwanted teacher who had believed that every broken heart could learn to bloom again. And every season proved them right.